My name is Lena Rourke. I'm 35, former strategic advisor for NATO's Covert Response Division, once led field ops in eastern provinces you won't find on official maps. Clearance level Black Echo. Black Echo isn't just a clearance level. It means your missions don't get names, your failures don't make reports, and your existence. It's a rumour, not a record. Commendation from 3 allied governments, none of them my own. But around here, I'm just his daughter. That's all I've ever been to Colonel Dorian Rourke. Not an officer, not a survivor, just the girl who didn't make it. Even after the things I've done, the things I can't put in a resume, the ones that left scars I don't name, he still looks at me like I'm an embarrassment he forgot to disown. Maybe it's easier that way. If I never existed, he doesn't have to answer for what he signed, what he erased. People think families fracture over politics, over distance, over time. Ours broke in silence, his and mine. That's why I returned to Fort Harrow under a different name with a clean file and a quiet reason. I didn't come for rank. I came for answers. For history. For the moment, he'd have to look me in the eye and realise I never disappeared. I just stopped waiting for permission to exist. And that moment, it didn't happen in an office or behind closed doors. It happened under full daylight on the parade ground, where every soldier could hear him say it. The morning sun was already harsh, casting sharp beams between the barracks like interrogators. The gravel underfoot crunched in a rhythm I'd memorized in another life. I stood at the edge of the formation, anonymous in uniform, no name called, no nod given. My name wasn't on the roster, not by mistake, by design. He'd made sure of that. My father, Colonel Rourke, stood on the platform, perfectly pressed spined, straight, like the base was built around his posture. He held the clipboard like a gavel. Next unit stepped forward when called. His voice had the same sharpness it always carried, part command, part disdain. He scanned the list, paused when his eyes landed where my name should have been. Then he looked up right at me and said it loud enough for the entire field to hear. "She's a failure, unfit for service." A few cadets blinked. One shifted his weight. Nobody laughed. Not yet. It was too early for that kind of cruelty. They were still trying to read the room. But one young officer didn't get the memo. Maybe it was the way I stood, or the way I didn't flinch. Maybe something in my posture looked familiar to him. He stepped forward instinctively and offered a crisp salute. "Ma'am," he said. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The colonel's head turned like it was on rails. "Wrong," he barked loud and final. The young man dropped his hand and flushed, stepping back, in line like someone had yanked his leash. I didn't say a word. I never do when it's about him. As I moved past the row of cadets, one of them bent down and picked something up from the ground, an old photo edges curled with time. He turned it toward me, confused. 2 people in it, me unmistakably younger and Falco. He was smirking like he knew something nobody else did, his hand on my shoulder, like we were equals or partners or something less definable. I didn't stop walking, just met the kid's eyes for a breath, then looked away. That morning smelled like metal and heat, like things that never soften, and it reminded me of another morning long ago. I was 10. It was raining. Not a soft drizzle, the kind that drenches everything, including your will. I'd made a mistake in formation, took the wrong step, messed up alignment. The whole squad had to run extra drills because of me. My father said nothing, didn't even look disappointed. He just stood at the edge of the field, his boots rooted in mud, his arms crossed, watching me stand there soaked and silent. Later that night, my mother found me peeling off wet socks in the corner of the kitchen. She didn't speak for a long time, just wiped the dirt from my face with the same cloth she used for dishes. I asked her if Dad was mad. She shook her head, not looking at me. "He thinks you need to learn something," she said. "I think you just needed a hug." I didn't respond. Neither did he. The silence sat at the dinner table longer than we did. That was the first time I realised I would never get to be fragile. And standing now in Fort Harrow uniform on name erased, I felt the same thing. Not pain, not anger, just the weight of knowing I was still being taught a lesson I no longer cared to learn. They assigned me to Bravo. No explanation, no nod, just a line of tape on a crate, and a bored clerk pointing without lifting his eyes. "Gears over there," he said. The crate was dented. The rifle inside jammed on first trigger check. My canteen had someone else's initials scratched in. We got leftover rations from Alpha past date lukewarm, rehydrated with pity. The latrines didn't flush right, and the comms buzzed with static when it rained. No one cared. That was Bravo. There were no briefings, no direct orders, just a whiteboard someone forgot to erase and rumours passed down like bedtime stories. Bravo operated on assumption, not instruction. If a name was misspelled on your badge, too bad. If your file didn't arrive, you didn't exist. Wrong name, you don't exist, a soldier muttered behind me one morning. Half joking, I turned to look at him. He flinched like I might report him. I didn't. What would I say that he wasn't wrong? Eli Ward was the loudest in our unit. Short-tempered, tall, walked like someone always watching his own shadow. He was the first to mock me, called me ghost file, said I walked too straight for someone who didn't officially exist. "You sure you're not here to spy on us?" he asked once during drills, eyes narrowed, voice too loud to be casual. I didn't answer. That annoyed him more. Silence draws out the worst in people. They fill it with their own fears. Every morning we lined up beside the barracks like we had somewhere to be. Bravo didn't have a drill instructor. We had a clock with a chipped face and an old intercom that crackled but never spoke. I stood beside a woman named Cho who double-knotted her boots and whispered her schedule like a prayer. She never made eye contact. I memorised the layout of the base in 2 days. Fort Harrow was smaller than I remembered, but colder. The metal rails had rusted in places, and the walls of the lower dorms were stained from a leak no one fixed. I walked the perimeter at night, careful to look like I was just trying to sleep off nerves. In truth, I was mapping patterns, guard changes, access doors, dead zones in the cameras. Some instincts never leave. One evening, I returned to find a smear of mud on my bunk. Eli stood near the door with a smirk. "Oops," he said. No one laughed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up and cleaned the floor with a dry sock, quietly, methodically. It wasn't about the dirt. It was about seeing how far they'd go. Bravo wasn't hazing. Bravo was forgetting. That's worse. Being erased is slower than being hated. There was a moment, though, that almost broke me. It wasn't the mud. It wasn't the silence. It was a small thing, like always. I twisted my ankle during an obstacle drill. Not badly, just enough to bruise. I limped back to the bunk room alone. No one asked if I was okay. I sat down and removed my boot, wincing. That's when the memory came. My mother never came to training, even when I was younger, when I still thought maybe she would. She was a military medic stationed near our base, but she never watched me run drills, never stood in the bleachers like the other parents. She waited at home. When I came back, bruised or scraped, she didn't ask questions. She just brought out the first aid tin, sat on the floor, and wrapped the bruises in silence. There was one time I had a gash just above my eye. I remember blinking through the sting of antiseptic and asking, "Does it hurt when you see me like this?" She didn't answer, just dabbed gently, then pushed back my hair and pinned it behind my ear like she used to when I was small. She didn't speak for the rest of the night. I found her in the kitchen later, crying quietly beside a pot of soup that hadn't been salted. That's the thing about wounds. The physical ones are loud. The emotional ones don't even knock. I thought of her as I iced my ankle with a wrapped ration pack. Thought of how she used to press cloth to my skin without asking if I was okay. Just did it. just stayed. She never spoke against my father, never praised him either. She just let him fill the room and hoped I would learn how to breathe in smaller spaces. Bravo was a smaller space, but it wasn't the smallest I'd known. That came earlier. Obsidian unit, classified even among the black tier programs. I was barely 25 when I got the unofficial nod, passed every simulation twice, and had a commendation from 2 foreign governments for a mission we never named. Then, just before final clearance, I was dropped. No explanation, just a sealed envelope and a 1-line memo reassignment order from internal review. I knew who signed it. I didn't even need to open it. My father was the reviewing officer. They told me later it was for my own safety, that Obsidian wasn't meant for familial entanglement. What they meant was he couldn't stand the thought of me outranking him in a place where names meant less than outcomes. Falco had warned me. If you get in, don't bring your name. Don't bring your bloodline. Just bring what you can survive with. Falco had been there before me. He was lean, fast, dark-eyed, and moved like someone who'd already lost everything once and didn't mind losing more. We trained together in a remote zone terrain that felt like war even on quiet days. He never raised his voice, never bragged, never slept more than 3 hours at a time. The day before my final evaluation, we ran a night op with faulty intel. A team member froze under fire. I moved too slow. Falco didn't. He stepped between me and a round meant for my throat, took it in the ribs and still dragged the recruit behind cover. I stayed low and finished the evac sequence, but he bled out before the chopper hit altitude. He didn't scream, he didn't curse, he just looked at me, half laughing, and said, "Don't say sorry, just outlive me." Then he was gone. Weeks later, someone slipped me his field notebook. It wasn't supposed to exist. Most pages were clean, like he knew they'd be read. But on the last one folded into the spine, he'd scrawled, "If you survive, let them see you don't need permission." That line lived under my skin longer than the shrapnel ever did. At Bravo during a marksmanship drill, we rotated through ancient rifles, probably used in training 2 generations ago. Mine had a cracked sight and a trigger pull that stuck halfway down. Eli made a show of nudging it toward me, laughing. "Let's see the ghost do her magic." I said nothing, took position, adjusted for wind manually, and fired 3 rounds in a tight triangle straight through the centre of the rusted target. The field went quiet. Even the sergeant watching didn't say a word. Eli blinked. Lucky, he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. As I reset the rifle on the bench, I noticed something etched into the concrete barrier behind the target zone. Faint, almost gone, 4 words carved by something sharp. He still watches. F. My heart skipped. Falco wasn't a name people remembered. Not officially. He was a whisper, a ghost that didn't stay. But someone else had known him here. Someone who remembered. The carving was worn, almost hidden under years of dust and rain, but it was there. He still watches. That night, I couldn't sleep. I reread his note, still memorized, still burned in the back of my head. I thought about what he said when we trained in the canyons. Don't ask permission for what's right. Do it. Raising your hand lets them shoot first. He wasn't just talking about combat. He meant life, identity, truth, all of it. Falco never made me feel like I had to prove anything. He saw through the name. He saw the fire I tried to keep buried. He gave it a place to burn without turning everything to ash. Losing him didn't just hurt, it left me hollow in a way silence couldn't fill. I watched Eli from across the mess hall the next morning. He glanced at me quickly, then away. Something had shifted. Maybe not respect, but awareness. Sometimes that's all you need to start changing the weather. Falco was gone, but not erased, and neither was I. We were gearing up for full-contact combat simulation drills that morning, Bravo versus Delta hand-picked matchups. The air was sharp with pre-storm pressure, and the cadence of boots thudding across the dirt made it feel like something bigger was waiting beneath the surface. I was paired with Vega, again, probably a joke from the instructors. She had been gunning for me since day one, a by-the-book lieutenant with a chip on her shoulder and a mouth trained to undercut. "Let's make this quick," she said, cracking her knuckles like it mattered. I gave a small nod and didn't break eye contact. No one was betting on me not out loud, but I could feel their assumptions. The whistle blew. We circled, feinted, grappled. Vega was fast, efficient, and mean. I let her land 2 hits, then locked her elbow, spun her low, and sent her shoulder first into the mat. She grunted, flipped back up, and lunged. We collided gear, scraping breath tight. That's when it happened. Her fist caught the strap of my vest, and with one yank, the right panel tore sideways. Gasps snapped across the field like electricity. Time fractured. The simulation screeched to a halt, not from the impact, but from what was now visible, a solid black tattoo across my shoulder. Bold, deliberate, unmistakable. Vanta 9. Not a symbol, not a flourish, just clean block letters like something carved into stone. Vega froze mid-motion, her fist dropped. She stared at the ink like it had opened a door she never knew existed. Then, her face went pale and she took a step back. "No. Way," she whispered. General Hayes, who had been walking the edge of the field with a clipboard, stopped cold. His gaze landed on my shoulder, then slowly travelled to my face. Without a word, he set the clipboard down, removed his cap and raised his hand in a formal salute. Silence fell like a blackout curtain. Every cadet, every instructor, every technician nearby halted. Some didn't even understand what they were seeing, but the ones who did, they stopped, breathing. Eli from the sideline squinted hard. "You're Vanta," he said under his breath. And then, for the first time since we met, he said nothing else. A veteran female officer, the one who'd always stood quietly at the edge of briefings, stepped forward instinctively. She stood to attention, her eyes shining, fists clenched at her side. Then she turned away slowly, her jaw trembling. I didn't know her name, but she had known someone like me. Or maybe once she had been someone like me. From the tower above, my father stood Colonel Rourke, pressed and poised like always. But his hands weren't at ease. He gripped the steel railing so tight, his knuckles were white like the rail itself might snap from the pressure. He didn't shout, didn't move, didn't acknowledge, just watched as if I were a ghost he didn't want to admit was still breathing. Somewhere behind me, a young recruit whispered, "I thought they erased them." I reached for the torn flap of my vest and pulled it back over the tattoo, slowly, methodically. Then I turned from Vega, still rooted in place, and walked off the field. No limp, no hesitation, no explanation. Just silence. The simulation was cancelled without notice. I barely made it to the barracks when the message arrived. Summoned to the base's internal review chamber, normally reserved for officers' intelligence screenings or worst-case scenario audits. I was walked there under escort. Not in cuffs, but not freely either. It wasn't arrest. It was protocol. Ghosts weren't supposed to surface without noise. Inside, 3 men sat behind a steel desk. No names, just ranks and cold eyes. One of them slid a card toward me with a code. For verification, he said. I answered all 3 questions. Code, phrases, locations. Mission, code names that hadn't been uttered in 6 years. By the end of it, one of them leaned back in his chair and muttered, "That unit doesn't officially exist." I replied, "That's the point." They let me go. No apology, no welcome back. Just a nod and a note to return the next day for further processing. Outside the door, the wind had picked up. Storm coming. but I'd been through worse. Like Pakistan, 2016. The explosion wasn't the kind that left clean craters or neat after-action reports. It was the kind that tore metal from bone heat, from skin and time from memory. The kind that makes silence your only language for weeks. Falco didn't make it. I did. Barely. We were clearing a compound for intel sweep off-book, no insignia, not even a name on our gear. 1 second we were inside, the next I was crawling through concrete dust and blood, one eardrum gone and Falco's voice already past tense. I blacked out halfway to the evac zone. They declared me KIA, killed in action. No press, no medals, just a cold summary and a zippered bag with someone else's tag. And at the bottom of my death file, my father's signature, Colonel Dorian Rourke. He didn't come to the debrief, didn't ask for a second opinion. Maybe he didn't even flinch. Weeks later, I surfaced in a classified recovery ward under the name Mira Jensen. No visitors, no noise, just IV fluid and white lights. The only thing louder than the silence was the question no one asked. Why did they want me erased? I saw the document again when I hacked into the internal archive, just a snapshot. My file had been amended quietly. Recovered, non-operational. The date of change matched the day I first moved my fingers again. It meant someone had known I was alive and decided to keep it quiet. But the paper trail wasn't what broke me. It was the memory that came before it. There'd been a test, a basic field drill years before. I was a cadet, and our squad leader went down real injury-fractured femur, losing blood. Protocol said to call it in and move on. Instead, I hoisted him onto my back and ran 2 miles in gear to reach extraction. We failed the mission clock. I failed the mark. When the grading sheet came back, 3 words were scrawled in the margin. Disobeyed direct orders. In my father's handwriting. I confronted him in the mess hall that evening holding the page. Why, I asked. Why penalise me for not leaving someone behind? He didn't even glance at the paper. Mercy is a weakness in war, he said. Flat. Final. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the perimeter of the training field and saw him standing alone at the edge, arms folded behind his back, looking up at the night like it owed him something. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but his posture sagged slightly, like someone who regretted a truth too late. It was the only time I believed he might have wanted to say, sorry, only didn't know how. After I returned, the world kept turning. Falco's name was etched on a wall in a room full of candles. Mine was not. I didn't exist officially. I wasn't buried, but I also wasn't alive. A few months ago, I ran into the mother of a teammate, Amira Solis, one of our tech specialists. We were in a train station cafe. She looked older, tired, a widow's grey scarf loosely knotted under her chin. When our eyes met, she froze. You look like someone I knew, she whispered. I nodded. I knew Amira. She dropped her bag. Her hand covered her mouth. They told me. You died with them. I didn't answer. She hugged me before I could stop her. It was the kind of hug you give a ghost. Tight, trembling, like she wanted to keep a piece of me this time just in case I vanished again. They said all of you were gone. I lit a candle every year, for all 5. I didn't tell her there had been 6 of us. After that day, I started asking the right questions, the kind that weren't meant to be asked. I pieced together gaps in paperwork missions that didn't align signatures that changed dates. Slowly, it became clear I wasn't dropped because I failed. I was dropped because I remembered. Too many names, too many anomalies, too many things that weren't supposed to survive. You can bury facts under ink. You can redact pages, delete footage, reroute emails. But you can't erase a person who refuses to vanish. That's why I kept the tattoo. Even after the skin healed, even after Command tried to cover it up. Because it wasn't just ink, it was proof of Falco, of Armera, of the version of myself that never needed clearance to tell the truth. They called me dead, but every breath I took after that was a quiet rebellion, a reminder that someone always survives to tell the real story. The proof arrived quietly. A folded slip of paper under my locker lid. No name, no seal, just an ink-smudged East Side 0500. I expected another prank, another test. Instead, I found Eli leaning against the fence, arms crossed, expression stripped of mockery. He didn't say hi, just handed me a file. This is yours. It was thin-aged, the kind of file that shouldn't still exist. I opened it slowly. My own death certificate? 2 versions. One dated 3 weeks after the Pakistan blast status, KIA. The second marked corrected per internal review, signed off by the same hand. My father's. You see it, Eli said. Not a question. 2 deaths, 1 lie. I looked up. Where do you get this? My sister had access once, he said, before they made her disappear. That caught me. What do you mean? He pulled out a different file, photos, copies of internal reports, scribbled names. Her name was Mia Ward, civilian data contractor, smart as hell, found inconsistencies in dismissal logs, score records, supply chains, tried to report them. 2 weeks later, she was deemed unstable, pulled from service, dumped back home with a sealed medical file and a non-disclosure order. And then she stopped speaking, deleted every email, burned every notebook, except 1 page. He held out a map, a layout of Fort Harrow, only it didn't match anything I'd seen. There were extra zones, unmarked buildings, training areas, labelled inactive with dates that didn't add up. She sketched this out before they came for her laptop, Eli said. Said it was her insurance. I studied it. The markings weren't random. They matched areas I'd passed that felt off, too quiet, too clean, like they'd been reset. Why give this to me? I asked. Eli took a moment. Because the only other person I've seen survive a cover-up is you, and because you stopped trying to prove anything. That's when I started listening. We sat in the gravel behind the rec tent, the wind threading through chain link. It was quiet enough that I could hear the plastic of the file creak when I shifted. You left your ethics exam blank, I said. He nodded. Yeah. Why? The prompt was, what matters more, obedience or integrity? He looked straight ahead. My sister chose truth, and now her name's not even in the database. I waited. He added I couldn't answer, not then. But now I'll live long enough to write my answer out by hand. Somewhere they can't erase it. For the first time I saw Eli as more than a loudmouth recruit with too much bravado. There was steel under his sarcasm, and grief he wore like body armour. Later that day, during drills, Eli didn't joke. He flanked without orders, spotted gaps in formation before the instructors did. When Vega barked at him for jumping a signal, Eli didn't flinch. Just said, I saw something you didn't. Then walked on. That night, I found another note in my locker. No words, just the name Mia Ward and a small circle drawn beside it. I opened Falco's old notebook. On the last page, beneath his final line, if you survive, let them see you don't need permission, I wrote Mia's name. The next morning, Eli walked past me in the mess hall, paused, saw the notebook in my hand, said nothing. But when he turned away, I noticed something new tucked under the elastic band of his own field manual, a blank notebook. Same size, same black cover. He tapped it once, a quiet signal. From that moment on, we didn't need to speak much. We wrote. We shared what we could when we could. Silent ledger keepers of the names they tried to erase, and every page filled was another inch taken back from silence. The next name came sooner than I expected. Megan Lee. She was in Bravo too quiet, but sharp, always finishing drills half a step ahead. You wouldn't notice her unless you were paying attention, and Bravo wasn't a place where people paid attention. But I did. One night, after lights out, she slipped me a flash drive wrapped in a note. They won't listen to me. Maybe they'll listen to you. On the drive were audio files, shaky recordings, but clear enough to catch the edge in the officer's voice. You think pointing out discrepancies will get you a medal? You'll be lucky if you're not scrubbing latrines by next week. Another file, Megan asking about test results. The officer, this is the military, not a democracy. Take the score you're given, or don't take the test again. I listened twice, then again. It wasn't just about scores. It was about fear, control, punishment. Megan had tried to speak up, and they didn't erase her name. They buried it. She never asked for help, never asked me to do anything. But the next day, I wrote her name in my notebook, beneath Mia's, next to Falco's. Then I handed the flash drive to Eli without a word. He just nodded. Later that week, I found Megan alone in the storage tent, stacking expired rations like they mattered. I asked her quietly, "Why give it to me?" She didn't turn around, just said, "Because you're not afraid of the noise." "I'm not afraid of the silence either," I said. That was all it took. I requested her as a volunteer monitor, a role Bravo never filled. No one noticed. Which was the point. With her access, Megan started logging equipment discrepancies, comm errors and training inconsistencies. Not officially. Just notes tucked into the back ends of forgotten files. Hidden where only someone who knew what they were looking for could find them. Eli and I built a secondary log, cross-referencing Megan's data with our own. The patterns weren't random. The sabotage wasn't just tolerated, it was built in. One night, Megan found me sitting outside the barracks. She sat beside me without asking. "I used to want a nameplate," she said. "Now, I just want my name to mean something." I handed her my notebook, open to the page where her name was written. "It already does." She smiled barely, then whispered, "You think they know we're watching them?" "I think they've forgotten how to look back." That wasn't the last conversation we had, but it was the one that stayed with me. In Megan, I saw what silence could become when it wasn't broken, but rerouted, used like a wiretap, thin and invisible, carrying truth beneath the noise. A week later, we faked a lost form to get access to archive transfer orders. Megan traced the digital footprint of every cadet reassigned from Bravo. 42 names, 17 inconsistencies, 6 unexplained dropouts, 2 who had been sent to rehabilitation facilities that didn't exist on the official map. We added those names to the list. Eli built a cipher to protect the log. Megan used shorthand so obscure it looked like inventory codes. I wrote each name in cursive, deliberately the way my mother once wrote my name on the inside of my jacket when she thought I was leaving for something safe. Sometimes Megan cried while entering notes. Not loudly, just quiet streaks down her face as her fingers kept typing. She never wiped them away, never hid them. And I never asked. Because this wasn't about staying strong. It was about staying present. In the mess hall, they still ignored her, still handed her trays late, still overlooked her when giving out assignments. And Megan let them. Because visibility in Bravo wasn't the same as power. Invisibility was. One afternoon, she passed by a group of instructors without saluting. One of them barked, "Lee, what's your excuse?" She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Wrong name, sir. Doesn't exist." He blinked, then waved her off. That night, she added her own entry to the log. Not a name, a note. They remember you just long enough to deny they forgot. Megan, the girl who almost disappeared, was now writing the record. The next morning, I left the barracks early, the sky still dim and quiet. Fort Harrow hadn't fully woken up yet. I liked it that way, before the drills, before the barked orders, before everything returned to routine, which was always someone else's version of order. I walked across the gravel lot to the admin wing. My boots crunched loud enough to remind me I was still here, still moving, still making choices. In my hand, I carried a sealed envelope, my death certificate, annotated with every correction I could verify, and Falco's old notebook, weathered corners, curled like it had been gripped too tight for too long. Colonel Rourke's office door was unlocked. Of course it was. That man didn't believe in locks-only surveillance. His desk was clean, immaculately arranged, that same ruler-straight mindset that used to shape the angle of my posture and the volume of my voice. I placed the envelope dead center, the notebook right on top. Page open to Falco's final entry. She is my correction. I didn't wait. I left the door half open. Let the evidence speak first. He found them later that morning. I didn't see his face when he read it, but I didn't need to. I felt it in the shift of energy that followed. Orders didn't come down as sharply. Instructors passed us with something closer to hesitation. And just before noon, a message arrived, report to Colonel's office. Immediately. It had been nearly a decade since I'd heard that tone with my name attached. When I entered, he was standing behind the desk, arms crossed, the notebook still open in front of him. The death certificate beside it marked up, verified, undeniable. You went digging, he said. I went surviving, I answered. A beat, then two. The room was too quiet. You weren't meant to come back, he added, his voice lower. Not regretful, just resigned. I know. You think I did this to protect myself. I think you convinced yourself it was the same thing. He sat slowly, a man folding under decades of choices. You don't understand the weight of what we carried, what we had to erase. I understand exactly what got erased, and what's still missing. He looked at me then. For real. Not the gaze of a superior or a disappointed father. Just a man watching the consequence of his decisions sit across from him, spine straight, unshaking. I didn't need your approval, I told him. But history deserves correction. His jaw tightened. His hand rested on the notebook like it might disappear if he let go. Why now, he asked. Because truth has timing, and I'm done waiting for permission. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. But his silence was different now. Not power, not defiance, just exposure. I remembered a time I'd seen him alone on the range, eyes to the sky, unaware I was watching. This felt like that. Before I left, I turned to the door, paused and repeated one of the first lessons he ever taught me. Thank you. I learned well. The next face I saw was Litton Vega waiting just outside the building. She used to glare when I walked past, mutter under her breath. But today, she stepped forward uncertain. I read the notebook, she said. I didn't mean to. It was passed around. I didn't ask how it got passed. I didn't need to. She hesitated, then added, I trust you more than I trust him. That landed heavier than anything else. Later that day, General Hayes called a meeting in the operations tent. Just us three. He placed his palms on the table, looked me in the eye and said, It's time we made this public. Not through memos, I said. Not a quiet update to the archives. It needs to be said. Out loud, where everyone hears it. You sure I've never been more? Hayes nodded once. Then, we do it tomorrow. Formation hour, no edits, no spin. And, just like that, the ghost story became real. After the ceremony, I walked off the parade ground, without fanfare, leaving behind rows of silent faces, and a father who had finally saluted me for real for the first time in 20 years. I didn't return to the army. Not the system that tried to erase me. But I wasn't done building either, I just chose a different foundation. 2 months later, I signed the lease on an old warehouse near the coast. concrete floors scarred with oil stains, brick walls pocked by time. It had no banners, no guard towers, just open space, and bare light bulbs hanging from the rafters. Blank enough to build something new. I painted a mural on one wall, grey silhouettes of soldiers' heads bowed. Underneath, in bold letters, "Protect people, not programs." Then, I hung photos of survivors, fellow cadets, veterans, recruits, who didn't make the cut, but kept going. Anyway, Mia, Megan, Eli, even the kid who forgot to salute on day one, I printed their names and a one-line note. Dissent will be remembered. Sacrifice is not silence. Truth outlasts erasure. Each week 5 people came. Some walked in wearing uniforms, others wearing hoodies and cargo pants. One was a nurse discharged for reporting medication errors. Another a translator whose accent didn't sound military. A third a mechanic whose PTSD file ate away any chance she had at command. They came with notebooks, tagged support, repair, prepare. No ego, no medals, just purpose. I met them all at the old steel table in the centre. No commander, stripes. Just 2 nameplates Falco's line in honour of the man who chose to correct the system, even with his life, and Lena Rourke below it, founder and survivor. One morning, a former elite soldier showed up, gun still in his hand. He'd been kicked out for refusing an illegal mission. All he wanted was a job, a sense of belonging. I didn't offer a uniform. I offered a role, lead instructor, resilience training. He said yes without asking titles. Megan came back too. She stood stiff, framed by crates of gear. I handed her a binder full of the logs she helped create at Fort Harrow. We walked through the names together. Your voice matters, I said. She opened her mouth, but the words were soft. I know, she nodded. It just took a place like this to let me hear it. Eli sent a quiet note from overseas. He'd joined a civilian intel unit as an analyst. He kept 2 notebooks at all times. One for work, the other labelled Falco's line archive. He wanted me to know the logs were still alive. The warehouse became a quiet hub. We didn't just train bodies. We trained people to question, to record, to remember. We taught how to maintain broken gear, yes, but also how to repair broken trust. We asked survivors to tell their own missions, not stretch over achievements, but acknowledge scars. We helped them carry those scars without shame. One day, a young recruit came in tears. He'd been discharged after reporting waste in supply. Instead of ignoring him, the base had sent him home. He kept calling himself a failure. I put my hand over his data card and said, "You're not erased." And we found a laptop and a friend with a recording device and turned the wasted orders into evidence. Within a week, the base had reopened the case. That afternoon, we stood in a circle, him, me, Megan, the nurse, the medic Eli, on a video link. We didn't clap, we held hands. Not because we won something, but because we built something without titles, but still real. On the windowsill, between the photo of Falco and the nameplate, I placed a worn leather patch that I'd taken from Fort Harrow, the Tier 4 insignia. I didn't rip it, I didn't burn it. I left it there to remind us where we needed to go, not away from the past, but forward using it. Mornings end with the same ritual. We stand in silence. No commands, no march, just eyes meeting. 1 minute of quiet. Then we begin. Each of us carries something, now knowledge, trust, memories, wounds. We carry it openly, not hidden. That's how you rebuild a system, one person, one story, one truth at a time. The day we opened the doors to the new training facility, there were no banners, no press, just a plain metal sign above the entrance Falco's line. It was Megan's suggestion. She said it quietly, almost like she didn't believe the words had weight. But they did. Falco had stood between us and the system once. Now we stood for those who never got the chance. Inside the main hall, past the racks of second-hand uniforms and repurposed gear, sat a table with a thick ledger bound in black. No fanfare, no announcements, just a pen, and a heading embossed on the front page, those they tried to erase. I started with names I remembered. Cadets failed for minor errors. Officers dismissed for speaking up. Medics who weren't fast enough, strong enough, obedient enough. One by one, I wrote them down. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't nostalgia. It was restoration. Megan added names too. Her handwriting smaller, neater, more careful. She sometimes included dates units, even short notes like spoke out during simulation or reported scoring errors. Every name was a whisper being made visible, and every page filled was a step away from silence. One afternoon, I found Eli sitting in the hall, the ledger open beside him. He hadn't added anything, just sat there, fingers tracing the edge of the paper. When I asked if he was okay, he didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and said, "My sister's name doesn't need to be first, but it should be in there." He didn't write it himself, just pointed. Megan understood. She added it while he watched. We didn't offer titles. No one here had ranks. But there was hierarchy of pain, of survival, of unfinished stories. The trainees understood that quickly. Some came because they'd been turned away elsewhere. Others came because they had nowhere left to go. One girl, barely 18, lingered by the ledger for hours, never writing a word. I approached her gently. She flinched but didn't leave. "You don't have to add anything," I told her. "Not unless you want to." She hesitated, then whispered, "If I write my name, will someone remember it?" I didn't answer with words. I handed her the pen. She took it with both hands like it was heavier than it looked. Her name was Celeste. She'd been pulled from a major program after a panic episode during drills. One error, one breakdown, and they'd marked her unsuitable for high-stress ops. But she hadn't given up. She just needed space, quiet, and someone to say, "Try again." Later, she told me, no one ever let me rewrite the story. They just closed the book. I pointed to the ledger. We don't close anything here. We just keep adding pages. That became our motto written on the back wall, in chalk add pages not endings. Every trainee passed it on the way to training. Some nodded, some didn't even notice. But I saw the difference in posture in questions asked in the way they stood taller after a few weeks. We didn't erase failure here. We taught them to frame it, to see it as a footnote, not a full stop. One evening, as the sun bled through the west windows, Megan came over holding Falco's old notebook. She'd found it in the storage box I never quite unpacked. "He wrote about you," she said. "A lot." I took it, opened to the final page. Just one line in his jagged scrawl. "If she builds anything from this ruin, let it be a shelter." Falco had never been sentimental, but he knew. Even then, he knew I'd carry pieces of what broke us. Now, we were laying them like bricks. I closed the notebook and looked around the room, half-lit quiet, filled with the kind of weight that comes from truth being spoken after too long buried. "I'm not here to lead an army," I told Megan. "I'm here to make sure no one has to hide in silence again." She nodded, eyes wet but steady. Outside, Celeste was teaching a newer recruit how to adjust her grip. Her voice was soft, her stance solid. She didn't look erased. She looked like proof, and that was enough for me. The day we opened the doors to the new training facility, there were no banners, no press, just a plain metal sign above the entrance Falco's line. It was Megan's suggestion. She'd said it quietly, almost like she didn't believe the words had weight. But they did. Falco had stood between us and the system once. Now, we stood for those who never got the chance. Inside the main hall, past the racks of second-hand uniforms and repurposed gear, sat a table with a thick ledger bound in black. No fanfare, no announcements, just a pen and a heading embossed on the front page, those they tried to erase. I started with names I remembered. Cadets failed for minor errors. Officers dismissed for speaking up. Medics who weren't fast enough, strong enough, obedient enough. One by one, I wrote them down. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't nostalgia. It was restoration. Megan added names too. Her handwriting smaller, neater, more careful. She sometimes included dates, units, even short notes, like spoke out during simulation or reported scoring errors. Every name was a whisper being made visible, and every page filled was a step away from silence. One afternoon, I found Eli sitting in the hall, the ledger open beside him. He hadn't added anything, just sat there, fingers tracing the edge of the paper. When I asked if he was okay, he didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and said, "My sister's name doesn't need to be first, but it should be in there." He didn't write it himself, just pointed. Megan understood. She added it while he watched. We didn't offer titles. No one here had ranks. But there was hierarchy of pain, of survival, of unfinished stories. The trainees understood that quickly. Some came because they'd been turned away elsewhere. Others came because they had nowhere left to go. One girl, barely 18, lingered by the ledger for hours, never writing a word. I approached her gently. She flinched, but didn't leave. "You don't have to add anything," I told her. "Not unless you want to." She hesitated, then whispered, "If I write my name, will someone remember it?" I didn't answer with words. I handed her the pen. She took it with both hands, like it was heavier than it looked. Her name was Celeste. She'd been pulled from a major program after a panic episode during drills. One error, one breakdown, and they'd marked her unsuitable for high-stress ops. But she hadn't given up. She just needed space, quiet, and someone to say, "Try again." Later, she told me no one ever let me rewrite the story. They just closed the book. I pointed to the ledger. "We don't close anything here. We just keep adding pages." That became our motto, written on the back wall, in chalk, "Add pages, not endings." Every trainee passed it on the way to training. Some nodded. Some didn't even notice. But I saw the difference in posture and questions, asked in the way they stood taller after a few weeks. We didn't erase failure here. We taught them to frame it, to see it as a footnote, not a full stop. One evening, as the sun bled through the west windows, Megan came over holding Falco's old notebook. She'd found it in the storage box I never quite unpacked. "He wrote about you," she said. "A lot." I took it opened to the final page, just one line in his jagged scrawl. "If she builds anything from this ruin, let it be a shelter." Falco had never been sentimental, but he knew. Even then, he knew I'd carry pieces of what broke us. Now, we were laying them like bricks. I closed the notebook and looked around the room, half-lit quiet, filled with the kind of weight that comes from truth being spoken after too long buried. "I'm not here to lead an army," I told Megan. "I'm here to make sure no one has to hide in silence again." She nodded, eyes wet but steady. Outside, Celeste was teaching a newer recruit how to adjust her grip. Her voice was soft, her stance solid. She didn't look erased. She looked like proof, and that was enough for me. They called it Fort Harrow's final dawn. The morning the gates closed, we gathered in silence. No parade, no brass band, no banners, just rows of cadets in faded gear and civilians carrying flowers. A line of plaques stood near the entrance, etched names of graduates, fallen heroes, and a new section, those they tried to erase. Some were uneven, edges smudged with fresh paint. Others, older, looked weathered names, like Celeste's written in trembling script. I stood at the front by the main arch. The sun hadn't broken clear yet, just a pale orange glow behind the old tower. In the hushed air, each shuffle carried weight, echoes of drills' footsteps, orders unspoken. I sat down in the parade yard, later on the same bench where I had once scanned the formation, hoping someone would say my name. Back then, there had been none. Now there were thousands of voices carried in memory, in plaques in a stone monument rising behind me, Fort Harrow, a place of truth and remembrance. I unfolded a letter from my father. He wrote, "Silence doesn't erase the truth. It delays it. You are more seen than either of us dreamed possible." No signature, just those words. Beneath the monument, Celeste placed a single white bloom by the new memorial. Fizzy blonde blooms, Alexa called them once, fragile but strong. I watched her kneel, standing the blossom, slowly straight brushing soil with slow fingers. She stood eyes steady. That was enough. A trainee approached me. Dark hair, eyes bright uniform new. "Ma'am, I've been meaning to ask." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Have you ever failed?" I remembered that day on the range, the trembling of the grip, the cracked shot, the contempt in my father's eyes. But failure isn't always a verdict spoken by others. I looked her in the eye. They called me a failure. They thought I couldn't survive what I survived. I paused. I didn't believe it. I saw something shift in her face, a spark as if permission had just been granted. She nodded. "Thank you." She left quietly. I listened as her steps carried off across gravel, leaving an echo of determination. I gazed at the sky, a wide, broken canvas. It held no approval, only air unfiltered, wind birds rising. For the first time, I didn't need someone behind me to push, or above me to judge. I was enough. Tears came, I didn't wipe them, not because I needed them, but because they were proof. Tears aren't absence, they're presence. The archive boxes were cleared that afternoon, uniform racks taken down, the barracks repurposed into community classrooms. The shooting range dismantled, target stands left, blank facing nothing. Echoes of gunfire turned into silence, but not empty silence. Companionship, solid ground. Megan and Eli and Celeste came by later. We walked together past the memorial. Celeste traced her name gently. Megan stooped and adjusted a wreath. Eli placed an old dog tag on a bench, his sister's tag. We didn't speak. We just stood, together. I thought of Falco. His notebook would have fallen apart here. But the shelter he built his line stood real. Stone, ink, people. That evening I returned to the warehouse. The ledger was gone. I smiled. We didn't need it anymore. Paper has its time. Memory has its permanence. Instead, on the front wall, I painted a single sentence. Your name belongs here where truth lives. I added one final signature beneath it, Lena Rourke. I left the warehouse behind too. No ceremonies, no speeches. I walked away knowing that the quiet work of remembrance didn't need titles. Only presence. I wasn't a commander anymore, just someone who refused to forget. One last time, I looked back at the memory centre lights flickering warm through windows. Voices inside teaching, sharing healing, a living echo. Then I stepped into the night. The wind carried laughter and critique and hope, and I followed it. The silence that had once tried to bury me now echoed louder than any order. I paused, breathed deep, and walked toward the sound. And maybe that's the thing we forget too easily. Sometimes silence isn't an absence. It's a space being made for truth. For someone to finally say, I see you. I know you weren't lying. I know what they did. If you're listening to this and you've ever been shut down, overlooked, or made to feel like your story was too small, too messy, too inconvenient to matter, this is for you. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. There are names like yours that never made it to rosters, but deserve to be remembered. And I promise you, someone out there is writing you back into the record, Right now, in so many parts of the world, people are reclaiming their stories. They're forming circles, support groups, digital logs. They're gathering under streetlights or in quiet kitchens telling the truth over cups of tea or shared scars. They're whispering things they were told never to say out loud and finding that whisper echoed in someone else's chest. Healing doesn't always look like fixing. Sometimes it just looks like naming. And sometimes, like Lena, it starts with a single question. Can I write my name too, if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause? If you saw even a piece of yourself in Lena's quiet defiance, then I hope you carry that forward. Share it. Sit with it. And if you're ready, tell your own. And hey, if you want more stories like this, real and raw and honest, consider subscribing. I'll be right here helping tell the ones that almost disappeared because we deserve to be heard. And we're not going anywhere.